All right, so as I mentioned, it was at least a year and a half ago that we were in Daniel, and that goes way before our conversation of merger. We had been going through the Old Testament for quite a while, starting in Genesis, and then we got through Second Chronicles, I believe, and then we went to Daniel, because Second Chronicles, towards the end, gives us the information of the Babylonian captivity. And so we jumped ahead to Daniel to study what it was like as a Jewish man with Daniel and his friends to be there in captivity, all the historic information plus the future information. What we decided as a class at that point was when we finished Daniel 6, which is a dividing point in the book of Daniel between the history of the Babylonian captivity and then the visions of what was to come in the future. We stopped at the end of chapter 6, and then we went back to Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, and then Malachi, because those events took place and gave us the account of the Jews' return from captivity. So we kept that historic aspect continuing with that thread, and then our plan was to come back and finish 7 through 12 as we look at the future. So we are going to do that, but because it's been so long since we've been in Daniel, and because we have so many new faces, at least for us, if you're coming from Buena Park, we're the new faces. And so I thought it would be a good idea to go back and kind of take a survey of chapters 1 through 6. And so my goal is to cover one chapter each Sunday, not to get into all the detail that we did before. I have notes here that I've prepared for you. If you want more information, I can give you some recommendations on good commentaries or books that would get you into much more depth than what we'll cover here. But this will give you a good understanding of what it was like to be a captive in Babylon, and to let you know what was going on, why they were there. When I say they, it would be the Jewish people from the southern kingdom of Judah, and how Daniel fits into all of that, which for most people, if you have been in church for a while, you have some understanding of Daniel, the character, the book. Even if you go, especially if you go into Sunday schools, of course they know about the lion's den, they know about the fiery furnace, as I think most Christians do, whether they know a great amount of information or at least they know the general story. This is the book where those events are accounted for us, they are preserved for us here. And so we will definitely cover that. We'll be looking at, as we saw last week, events like the handwriting on the wall, Nebuchadnezzar's statue that he sets up on the plain of Dura, Daniel's interpretation of vision and dreams, all of these things that are part of the book of Daniel. And so as we come to Daniel chapter 1 this morning, let me go ahead and read through chapter 1, and then we're going to come back and take a look at it, and we'll take a look at three sections this morning. We'll look at the besieging of Jerusalem. So we'll see that in verses 1 and 2, where Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he takes over that capital city, and then obviously takes over the nation as he is coming off of his defeating the Egyptians. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Then we'll look at the second point, which is the brainwashing of the Jewish captives. Okay? That is where Nebuchadnezzar, in a sense, handpicks. He chooses who he wants to bring back to Babylon to serve him, and in that process of training, the goal really is to brainwash them. It's to make them think like Babylonians and serve the Babylonians. So we will see that. And then we will see the blessing of God upon Daniel and his companions. That will be verses 8 through 21. So let me read chapter 1, and then we'll get into these three areas of Daniel 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youth in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court, and he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food, and from the wine which he drank. and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he named the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord, or my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then he would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine which they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. So if you go to verses 1 and 2, we'll look at this first section, and that is the besieging of Jerusalem. We have here kind of a bookend. There's a lot of information in between, but when you look at the beginning of chapter 1 and then the end of chapter 1, it gives us the time frame that Daniel covers. It covers this time frame of, it covers the time frame from when Nebuchadnezzar came in and took Jerusalem all the way to the end of Daniel's reign here, or Daniel's service, in the first year of Cyrus the king. So that covers this 70-year span, and we have that given to us in chapter 1. But as we come into this book, it comes in with just a little bit of information to the reader. It tells us that all of these events, the reason why the Jewish people were in captivity, it begins with Nebuchadnezzar coming to Jerusalem. And of course, when you were there as one of these captives, you would have known the history, you would have known what was taking place there. Even if you were born in Babylon, I'm sure that the families would have told their children how they ended up there, told them stories about home. So this was common knowledge to Daniel and his companions and those who were reading this. But for us, when we look at this, we need to understand a little bit about why the Jews were here in captivity. And it really starts out with King Jehoiakim. It goes before that, but we see this in 2 Chronicles. So turn there if you will. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 1 through 8. And we'll see that it was during Jehoiakim's reign that we see the beginning of this Babylonian captivity. Chapter 36 of 2 Chronicles, and we'll just take a look there at verses 1 through 8. Yes, 2 Chronicles 36, 1 through 8. Beginning in verse 1, it says, Then the people of the land took Joahaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in place of his father in Jerusalem. Joahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Then the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem, and imposed on the land a fine of 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. The king of Egypt made Eliakim his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But Necho took Joahaz his brother and brought him to Egypt. So we see there a little bit about the Egyptians. Before the Babylonians came in, Egypt was the world power. Egypt comes into the land, they remove one king, and the Pharaoh Necho puts another king in his place. His name is Eliakim, but his name is changed to Jehoiakim. That's who we see mentioned in Daniel chapter 1. And so there you find Egypt in power. Verse 5 says, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Now, let me just stop there for a little bit and just say something about the kings of Israel and Judah. Even though there were some bright spots, of course, I think probably one of the most famous would be Josiah. Young King Josiah who finds the law, finds the word of God, and leads the people in reform. But the vast majority of the kings of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah, they brought wickedness into the land of Israel. And there were constant warnings of the consequences to come. And what you see with the Assyrian invasion in the north in 722 and the Babylonian invasion in the south is really the consequence of their own wickedness. They are paying for their own sins. And so we see here as we look at what it says about Jehoiakim in verse 5 of chapter 36. It says, he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. And when the king did evil in the sight of the Lord, it really was that trickle down. It started at the top and it went all the way down to all of his leaders, his officials, down to the people, to the priests. You see that constantly throughout the history of Israel. That the people will follow their leaders, and that's what happened here. That doesn't mean that every single Jew was in rebellion. There were those people that were faithful to God, but the vast majority of the nation was turning against God and following the lead of their wicked kings. And they dearly paid the price. Well, in verse 6 it says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him with bronze chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also brought some of the articles of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. So that was raiding the temple, taking those articles used for worship, bringing them back to Babylon to be used in the Babylonian temple. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations which he did, and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place. We'll stop there. We won't go into the history of Jehoiachin. We'll just look here at with Jehoiakim. And so when you look at this, Jehoiakim was rebellious. He was wicked. The nation on many times was told to repent by the prophets, and the people were reaping what they sowed. And so the reason for them being here, as we will see throughout the book of Daniel, is because they were being punished by God. There was a punishment, there was also a refining, but there was a blessing at the end. So we'll see all of those things as we go through the book of Daniel. Yes, they were being punished, but in the end it was going to be used to glorify God, to bring his people back to the land, to get them back on the right track. And we see that as they return and rebuild the walls, rebuild the gates, and reestablish worship 70 years later. But it's going to take some time. And so this is all part of the consequence of their rebellion. When you look at the next one, which is Nebuchadnezzar's subjugation, he comes into Jerusalem and he takes over. And as I mentioned last time we were together, the Jews are deported in 3 stages. There are 3 different waves of deportation. And so you'll read about those throughout the Old Testament, various passages, that they were taken, one group and then another group and then another group, as they were being taken from their land to serve in Babylon. But what was happening here, and this is kind of a rough map, is that Egypt was the power at the time. The Babylonians, as they were rising to power, and Nebuchadnezzar, as he is there, involved in this expansion of the Babylonian kingdom, we see from history that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, defeated Egypt at Carchemish, which is up at the very top. You can kind of see in pink, those are kind of the modern day boundaries, and then you see where these events would have taken place. And so you have Carchemish up there to the north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a little bit down on your left bottom screen. If you look across from Jerusalem, you see Babylon, modern day Iraq. So this is where all of this was taking place. After Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, then you see him moving down south and expanding that realm of the Babylonian Empire, and he goes to Jerusalem. And so as we see here, going back to Daniel chapter 1, let me get back there myself. We see here that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, and some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. It's interesting, when you look at this land, it's called the land of Shinar. That is the same term that is used to describe the land during the time of the Tower of Babel. You remember that story? I think that's a very popular Old Testament story. All the peoples of the earth are gathering together. They are making a name for themselves. They are building this massive tower to reach to the heavens, reach to the gods, establishing their authority and their protection. And before they can complete it, God comes down and stops their construction. He confuses their languages, they scatter, and that's how we see all the people groups of the earth as they go out. But when you look at Shinar and Babylon here, the names are used for the same location. So there's a connection there between those Babylonians from Babel and what you see here with Nebuchadnezzar and taking them to the land of Shinar. Interesting, when I've seen various artist renditions of the Tower of Babylon and then the ziggurats of Babylon, this isn't a rendition of what it would have looked like. Okay? And this would have been one of the temples that was there. And so Nebuchadnezzar raised the temple in Jerusalem, and he's taking those articles to be used in temple worship here in Babylon. And so we'll talk more about that throughout our study in Daniel, the way that the Jews are being expected to conform to Babylonian culture and Babylonian religion. So Nebuchadnezzar goes in, he takes over Jerusalem, he takes individuals back for his service, he takes articles from the temple, and he uses them in the worship of their gods back in his home country. And so here again with Nebuchadnezzar expanding and taking over Jerusalem, he is growing in power. And so the Egyptians are decreasing in their power, Babylon is growing, and from the human perspective, if we were to just stop right there, we would look at it and say, Babylon is this massive world power. And they are going in with their authority, and they're dominating whoever they come across. And they are expanding their territory, and they are the greatest power at the time. And from a human perspective, that is true. But when you go back to chapter 1, verse 2, and this is that third point, just that this first area of besieging of Jerusalem, this really is all about God's sovereignty. And as I mentioned before, when you read the book of Daniel, we have some human main characters. We have some events that would have all human eyes on the events, and if you're not careful, you might overlook the fact that it is God who is sovereign in all of these events, behind all of these individuals. When you look at chapter 1, verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar. Make no mistake, Babylon was powerful. They were a mighty kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar was powerful. He was successful in what he was doing in expanding the Babylonian Empire. But the authority behind what is taking place here is God.
Amen.
The reason why the Jews ended up in captivity is because God gave them into the hand of the Babylonians.
Right.
God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to go into the temple and take these things. Everything that Nebuchadnezzar does, everything that Pharaoh Necho did, everything that every human sovereign today does, is because the Lord allows it. There are times when he ordains it, and he says, this is exactly, my plan that will glorify me. We don't want to ever make anything seem like it's outside of God's control. But there are certainly things that we do as human beings that God has no pleasure in. And there are other things where God is, in his providence, using those things that bring him pleasure. And both, whether it's wicked or it is honoring to God, he uses them to accomplish his plan. Well, here he's using this godless Babylonian kingdom to bring about the punishment to the Jews that was prophesied about so many years before. And they are going to be his human instrument to bring about this captivity for his people and this purifying of his people and ultimately bringing them back to Jerusalem. When you look at yet another kingdom that's going to rise as we read through the book of Daniel. And so we want to make sure that we understand this theme throughout Daniel, and we'll see it, and I will bring it up every time that we find it in the text, is when you look at God's invisible hand, God's sovereign authority, his providential care. We're going to see that time and time again through the book of Daniel. And so, was Jehoiakim rebellious? Yes. Was Nebuchadnezzar powerful? Yes. Was this a consequence of a greater empire taking over a smaller kingdom? Yes. But this was all God orchestrating this. He was bringing about the judgment on his people by the hands of the Babylonians, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And so we need to understand that and remember that it is always God who is in control. If you were to take a look at Daniel 4, jump ahead just a little bit as we talk about this sovereignty of God. There is going to be a time, and we'll get to that in a few weeks, when Nebuchadnezzar realizes that it is God who is sovereign. Verse 31, a voice comes from heaven and speaks to Nebuchadnezzar, and it says, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. Okay, your human sovereignty, your human authority has been stripped. It's taken away. And only a greater sovereign can take that away from King Nebuchadnezzar, and that is God who is sovereign over all things. After a time of punishment on Nebuchadnezzar, in verse, we'll begin in let's just read through 32 and following. You'll be driven away from mankind, your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. That means you have authority, you're powerful, but guess what? There is a greater authority and a greater power, and the reason why you are in authority is because of this greater power, because of God. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride.
Amen.
Now, if we take that and we reverse that, we take it back to Daniel 1, we take it back to 2 Chronicles 36. Jehoiakim is the king there in Jerusalem. He was arrogant, he was prideful, he was rebellious and sinful and worshiping false gods and doing evil in the sight of the Lord. And what did God do? God stripped away his sovereignty. He took away the authority that was given to him. He humbled him. God did that to Jehoiakim, one of his chosen people, one of his Jewish people. He did that to Nebuchadnezzar, one of the Gentile kings. And so God's sovereignty doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't have limits. He is sovereign over Jew and Gentile. He is sovereign over everyone in all of creation. because he is the creator. And so as we go back to Daniel 1, we understand, yes, Egypt was in control, and then Babylon, who was more powerful at the time, comes in. Jehoiakim's taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, and the Jewish people are exiled, but the sovereign power always is God. And God is the one who allowed his people to go into captivity for a greater purpose. It is to show them their sins. They pay the consequence of that. They come back home, and in the end, God is glorified. So we see that as we look at the besieging of Jerusalem. Let's take a look at the brainwashing of the captives, verses 3 through 7. As we look here, we understand that Nebuchadnezzar, in a way, hand-selected people. Okay? Verse 3 says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, who had ability for serving in the king's court. Okay? The goal was very clear. He wanted to go in and get the cream of the crop. He wanted the best of the best, because his plan was to bring them back and put them into service for him. He didn't want to just grab anyone. He wanted the best of the best. And so he sends in his official, Ashpenaz, who is the chief of the officials, and he has a very important task. He is to bring these people back, select them, bring them, put them through a course of training. And his name, Ashpenaz, if you look at Old Persian, the idea there is an innkeeper or a guest master. And so he was to be in charge of these captives. He was to oversee their instruction, their care, to make sure everything went according to plan, to bring these people from their Jewish homes into Babylon, retrain them, to make them Babylonian in every way except for their genetics, and then to present them to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 3 years so they could serve him. And so a very important man for a very important task. Bring me the best of the best, is what Nebuchadnezzar said. And Daniel was one of these individuals. It's even thought that Daniel was perhaps from royalty or nobility, as it says here that he brought in members of the royal family and the nobles. And then these youths whom was no defect, were good looking, and on and on. And so Daniel could very well have been one of those children of royalty, children of nobility. And he was brought in with his companions to serve Nebuchadnezzar. And so he wanted the best people. He wanted those who were socially superior, the royalty, the nobility. He wanted the physically superior, right? No defect. They were good looking. He wanted the mentally superior. They were showing intelligence. He said, I want them to be excellent in every way, better than everyone else. Bring them to me. And they were to be trained here in the ways of the Babylonians. If you look at the rest of verse 4, he ordered him to teach them, he ordered Ashpenaz to teach these captives the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Well, let's stop there for a little bit with the idea of the Chaldeans. It is possibly a reference to an ethnic group, where they were called the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. But it seems that maybe, I believe that there's evidence that this was more not an ethnic group, but a reference to the astrologers, the magicians, the diviners. If you look at the end of chapter 1, verse 20, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. Okay, the Chaldeans, there was a group of men who were called the Chaldeans, and they were known for their knowledge in astrology and magic. And so it's saying here that they were beyond these men. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And so it's possible that they were not just being trained as Babylonians, but specifically as the Chaldeans. These well-educated, knowledgeable servants of the king. These men who he would call upon for information, for answers, for results and solutions to his problems, and to solve mysteries. And as we look at through the book of Daniel, you'll find that. Where there are times when the king is troubled because he is experiencing things, he is having these dreams or visions, he has these messages sent to him, he's calling for his magicians, he's calling for his conjurers, and they have no answer for him. And God gives Daniel the answer. And so as they are trained in this literature and language of the Chaldeans, I think it's a good possibility that's what we're looking at here when you parallel that to verse 20, that they are being trained to serve in this realm here, like the astrologers, magicians, the diviners, those who would be very useful to Nebuchadnezzar, where he would go to them and seek those answers from them. But they were trained to think like Babylonians. Some commentaries have said that maybe the idea is to send some of them back to Judah, to keep some in Babylon, so that way those who go back to Judah would then kind of, in a sense, kind of brainwash the others as well. Hey, they treated us real well over there. They fed us great food. They educated us. These people are okay. And so as he is trying to keep his realm, the kingdom, in control, a good way is to take those individuals, train them, and then send them back and let them be representatives. Let them go back and convince the people who are still there that this is actually a good thing for them. So that is perhaps another motive for this. But we understand Daniel and his friends, they stayed there in Babylon to serve. And as I mentioned last week, or last time we were together, part of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, a large portion. Well, when they were being trained in the ways of the Chaldeans, the literature and the language, they would have been taught to speak and write and read Aramaic as well, which gives us now a little more insight as to why a good portion of Daniel is written in Aramaic. They are also given the king's food, and there has been a lot of speculation about this. Food from the king's table to be served to those individuals who were considered part of the king's household. And so he would give them the same kind of rations. And the idea there is perhaps that he would create in them a reliance upon him and an attitude of gratitude. Say, hey, the king's feeding us. He's taking care of us. So this guy's not all that bad. He could have killed us. He could have put us in the dungeon. But here we are being educated, and here we are living in his kingdom, and we're being given the same food from his table. And so it really is that brainwashing of the people that Nebuchadnezzar is not all that bad, and it's a good thing to serve him. They were given new names as well. And names were very important back then. Did you? Or you just, no, okay, that's a question. If you were to go ask someone today, I would say someone younger than, let's say, 40 or 50, and you ask them the meaning or the history of their name or their family, they would have no idea, and they couldn't care less. Most people. I remember when my grandfather, on my father's side, did this search, this name search, and he was able to track our family back to Spain and to some sort of nobility in Spain. He was so excited. He got the crest and the meaning of all of that framed. And we were all together one day at his house, and he was explaining to us what he found and how many generations it goes back. And it was interesting, but I even forgot all of that, so bad grandson, right? But, names meant something, and they still mean something. But back then, in that ancient Near Eastern culture, names were very important. There was that family identity, and often there was identity with deities as well. And so the changing of the names was not just changing their names to Babylonian names, but it was changing them so they would now be connected to Babylonian gods. So really this brainwashing was everything. The food they ate, the languages they learned, the things they studied, the names they had. He wanted to make them Babylonian through and through.
Doesn't Caballero mean gentleman?
It does, yeah. Uh-huh. So we have a lot to live up to. Yeah.
I was also thinking of the people who immigrated here a long time ago, and would often change their name because they wanted to separate themselves, or their name would be changed sometimes for them from the country that they came because they were looked down upon for being Irish or for being Italian, or for, so they would tweak their name or whatever. Yeah. And now it's almost impossible for some of them to, look for their roots and their ancestry.
Right, they lost that connection there, right? So for Daniel and his friends, and these people at this time, names were huge. And to change their names from Daniel to Belshazzar, and Hananiah to Shadrach, and Mishael to Meshach, and Azariah to Abednego, there was a connection to those Babylonian deities, in the provision for them, the sovereignty of these deities. There was a connection with all of those names. And so Nebuchadnezzar was really changing everything. It was the service to the king and the submission to the gods. That's what he was trying to instill in these people. And so, but we find out early on that Daniel isn't having any of it. And of course, Daniel's resolve comes because he is a servant of the true living God. And the Holy Spirit is working in the life of Daniel, because we know that no one can take this kind of stand, no one can have this kind of faith, live a life for the Lord that is so set apart, unless the Holy Spirit is working in his or her life. And so, while we do put often all eyes on Daniel, and it's like dare to be Daniel, and it's always the emphasis there with Daniel and his companions, well, yes, they stood firm, there was resolve not to be defiled, but in the end, you have to give credit where credit is due. It was God who was giving them that faith and that knowledge and that wisdom and that motivation, that ability to stand firm. And so not to take away their responsibility, not to take away the expectation that they stand firm, but they couldn't do that without God's provision. They had to rely on the provision of the Lord in order to do that. And we'll see here that God does come through once again. So when you look at verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself. Let's see. Here we go. The blessing of Daniel on his companions. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. And so, the reason for Daniel rejecting the food, and I've given you a few ideas here that various commentators have offered. As to why Daniel said, I don't want to eat that food. One was that it was food sacrificed to false gods. That I can't eat that because it's given to the false gods. And then, a good question, well, wouldn't the vegetables perhaps have been served to the false gods as well? Yet Daniel wanted to eat the vegetables. And I'm not saying that, which one is, absolutely true, but that's one idea. Dietary laws. What he would say, I'm Jew, and these certain things have been prohibited for us to eat. We can't have these because of the Jewish dietary laws. But then the commentator says, well, even the wine he rejected. And when you look at the dietary laws, you don't see wine being prohibited unless you took the Nazirite vow. So, interesting point. Another said it was the appearance of acceptance of the overlordship of Nebuchadnezzar. That he didn't want other people to think that he was caving in to being one of Nebuchadnezzar's, little trainees or whatever he wants to call them, devotees. He's like, I'm not selling out to Nebuchadnezzar. An interesting point is that this opposition was a private matter. It wasn't done in the public eye for everyone to see. I thought a very interesting thought was that, and let me tell you this, the one that I hear most often is that it was food sacrificed to gods. And I'm not saying that that isn't a possibility. That certainly could have been an issue because they would have been sacrificing these foods to their deities, whether it was something prohibited to the Jews or not. If it was sacrificed to the foreign gods, Daniel could very well have said, I don't want any part of that because this is sacrificed to them. So I'm not saying it's not a valid option. One commentator that I read brought up this point, that it was reliance upon God for provision as opposed to the human king. Where Daniel was saying, I don't need the king's food to keep me healthy. The Lord will keep me healthy, even if I'm eating something just like vegetables. It's an interesting thought. And so whatever position wherever you fall in, I think the vast majority of people go to the food sacrificed to false gods. This isn't one of those areas where it's going to separate, our fellowship. I can't say dogmatically what it was. I think it's a good possibility that it was food sacrificed to gods, and Daniel said, I don't want any part of that. But I don't doubt either that Daniel was saying, the Lord will take care of us. And we see that here, that it's going to be the Lord who sustains them, and that it's not the human king that they have to rely on for their every matter of existence, that God will provide for them. So no one specific answer is given in the text. We're just told that he wanted to keep himself from being defiled. And so that is the main point. Somehow eating this food would cause Daniel to be defiled, either in his conscience or violating some dietary law, or if it's food sacrificed to gods, whatever it was, Daniel's conviction was, if I eat that, it's not going to be good for my person. I can't have it. And I don't think it was just a physical issue. It was his spiritual issue that he was looking at. And God intervenes for them. You look at verse 9. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. That is so important for us to understand. This man, Ashpenaz, has nothing to gain and everything to lose by Daniel and his friends not eating the food that the king has given to them. This man is under very specific orders from the king. Train them in these arts. Train them in these languages. Feed them this food. Give them these rations. Because in 3 years, I'm going to see what's become of these people. And you are in charge of them. Remember, you're that innkeeper. You're the what do we say it was here? Was it? Yeah, I'm on the wrong page. Here we go. You're the innkeeper. You're the guest master, right? You're the one in charge. You're the host. Take care of them. So Ashpenaz, he's got nothing to gain. And he has everything to lose. In fact, he says, if you look at verse 10, he says, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should you see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. He says, look, if I agree to this, I could lose my head. Not just my job, but I could lose my life. You don't know what you're asking, Daniel. You're asking way too much. And the important thing here is that God granted favor and compassion. Now, Daniel does come in as we look at verse 11. Daniel comes in with a good compromise. He comes in with a good plan. He comes in with a plan that is going to allow him to keep himself undefiled, but it also gives this man some assurance that, look, if provision for me isn't made, and Daniel's not saying if my God doesn't do this, or he just says, look, give us 10 days. And if we aren't looking good, then we'll go back to your plan. And I think implied in all of that, Daniel was trusting in the Lord for the provision. And as we see in verse 8, it was God who granted compassion and favor in the sight of the commander and the official. And so that's exactly what he does. Verse 14, so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And so as God intervenes, wisdom is demonstrated on Daniel's part, making that reasonable compromise. Ashpenaz, his heart is softened. He has that compassion for Daniel and his friends. And in the end, it is God who provides for Daniel and his companions. They come through, and they are looking great. When you look at verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food, and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And so here, God provided for them in this nutritional provision. They were eating just vegetables, and they were drinking water, and they were great. Now, this is not the case for some kind of vegan diet. This is not a 10-day cleanse. You know, you've heard of those things, right? Like the juice cleanse or whatever. This is not the reason why they look better. Now, I'm not telling you that if you shouldn't take care of your health, and if you're eating way too much, fats or sugars or whatever, that you shouldn't change that and, hope to see some nutritional benefits and your appearance will change. It probably will. I'm sure it will do you good, but that's not what's happening here. The Bible is not just telling us here that their choice of food gave them better health. This is God who is sustaining them.
Amen.
Okay, this is not just something that science or nutrition can write off and say, this isn't a miracle. This isn't God's hand at work. It's all about their metabolism. It's all about fat-burning foods. It's all, no. This is about God taking care of these men. God is not going to allow them to look haggard. He's not going to allow them to look malnourished. He's not going to decrease their energy levels or their strength or anything. He's going to he makes them look superior to everyone else. Not just in their physical health, but in their intellectual abilities. When you look at verses 17 through 20, as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So as we look here, they're not just learning everything that the Babylonians were wanting them to learn and excelling in that, but Daniel specifically was given this supernatural insight. And God was going to use that in the years to come. That God had enabled Daniel to understand all kinds of visions and dreams, and in the end, he was going to be able to interpret what none of the Chaldeans could interpret. And that was going to be used by God to give Daniel even more favor and success in Babylon. Because God is equipping him with that divine information that they could never have apart from God's direct intervention. And so as we look at this, once again, the third time in this chapter, we see that the Lord was at work behind the scenes. First of all, he sends Jehoiakim. He gives Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And then God grants Daniel favor and compassion in verse 9. And then 17, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. And you look at that here, we already see God is at work. And again, that is one of the main themes of the book of Daniel, is the sovereign hand of God. Tremper Longman, in his commentary on Daniel, says this: though in exile, God gives his people the ability to prosper as well as to be faithful. Very important for us to understand that. Remember, they're going to be there 70 years. Jeremiah told them, you're going to be there a long, long time. Plant those roots, get married, have children, build a house, get your career, whatever you're going to do, you're going to be there for a long time. And pray for that nation. Because what's good for them is good for you. What's bad for them is bad for you. You're going to be there, but you're not going to be there simply as slaves. You can live a comfortable life there. You can build your family. You can build your career. You can have, these nice things in Babylon. But make sure you pray for the nation. And make sure you don't lose faith in God. Now, when we come to, the application and the lessons for us, I think there's two that are very simple as we bring it to a close here. One is that God is in control of every situation. We need to understand that sometimes as Christians we forget that. That every situation we find ourselves in, God is sovereign. There is no doubt about that. Whether it is in your finances, it is in your marriage, it is in your career, it's in your health, it's in the ministry of the church, it's in the political state of our nation. Whatever it might be, God never relinquishes his authority. He is always sovereign. And that is whether or not we look at our specific situation or the events taking place around our lives, and they are favorable or unfavorable, they're comfortable or uncomfortable. It doesn't matter. God is always in control. In this case, the Jews are in captivity for 70 years, and God reminds them, I'm still in control. And we need to remember that. And then this, our faith prepares us, or faith prepares you to live in a pagan culture. And we see that here. We can live successfully and faithfully and prosper in a pagan culture. And I think that is important for us in the United States more now than ever. We are not the country that we were over 200 years ago. We are not the same country we were even 20 years ago. Things are going to get more and more difficult for those who follow God, for those who claim the name of Christ, for those who believe that the Bible is God's authoritative word. It's going to get harder and harder with every passing day. But understand this, that our faith in God, the wisdom from his word, his sovereignty, gives us everything we need for life and godliness, even in the midst of a pagan culture. We can live in this country as bad as it's getting, as bad as it's going to get. We can live faithfully and honorably to God, and we can still prosper here. We need to follow those principles that the Jews were told to follow and make sure that we serve God without any compromise, don't allow ourselves to be defiled, and we make sure that we never forget who's in charge. And if we keep those things in mind every day, we're going to have success living for the Lord. It could mean that at times we're in the dungeon, like Joseph was in the dungeon. It could mean that we're in the penthouse. It could mean we're somewhere in between. But in the end, we will always be serving and honoring God, and God will honor that. And many times he will use us, as he used his people, to be a blessing to both believer and unbeliever alike. And we'll see that as we move on with Daniel in this book, that he was a great blessing to these pagan kings. And he was loved by them. And that is used by God to bring a great blessing, not just to Daniel, but to all of his people. Any last thoughts or comments before we close?
I don't think that it's possible to overemphasize God's sovereignty, because we've been raised in a democracy, and that helps. We have a wrong view of monarchs and kings and queens and all that kind of thing. So actually, if you understand the kings of the earth, in a sense, it helps us to understand God's sovereignty. But anyway, but the man who did the greatest job of teaching God's sovereignty was Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the most sovereign monarch that ever walked the earth. He was the head in Daniel's statue as such. He was the head of gold, wasn't it, gold and silver? And so as you go down that statue, you get to lesser and lesser sovereign nations, all the way down to Rome, they had some sovereigns. Anyway, I'm taking too long, but it's.
I'll let you teach next week.
It's a wonderful, glorious teaching of who God is, of who the Lord is, and Nebuchadnezzar taught that, and he knew what he was talking about.
He did. He had to learn the hard way, as most of us do, but he knew. And let me just say this as we close. I think the attributes of God, as we see with sovereignty, is one of the greatest studies that you can be involved in.
Amen.
And so, with that said, on Wednesday evenings at 7, guess what we're studying right now? The attributes of God. So come on down at 7 o'clock on Wednesday if you can. And we're going to be looking at about 24 attributes of God over the next few weeks. And so, just a little plug there for our Wednesday evening study. Let me close in prayer, then we'll be dismissed. Father, we come before you. We thank you so much for this morning. We thank you for letting us just make our way through this chapter and to have some insight, Lord, into how you work and how powerful and wonderful and glorious you are. We thank you that you constantly remind us that you love your people, you have a plan for your people, and that no human or created power can alter that. No one can change that. And that you will bring about your good purposes and plans for your people. We thank you for that. And we pray that we will be faithful to you no matter what the situation is around us, whether we are comfortable or uncomfortable or have plenty or have nothing, that we will always be focused on serving you and having you as our greatest affection, our greatest love, and to know that you will never mislead us and that you always have our best interest and the glory of your name in your will. We thank you, we praise you in Christ's name.